So I'm going to start this project by breaking down MDF over at the track saw and then back to the table saw. Basically, I just want to get into as large of a manageable piece as possible and then use the table saw on the fence. I find that to be far more consistent. And while the dust collection on the track saw is really good, I find the dust collection on the table saw is much better when you actually turn it on. It really is because of the dust that I try to use MDF as little as possible. But where I really do like it is for my tabletops. And what we're doing right now is we're going to laminate two pieces of 3/4 inch MDF together. And that's going to be the top of a router table. MDF is very flat and very stable. And for that reason, I find for all my workbench tops, it works a little bit better than plywood. So my primary goal with this router table is really just to relocate where the router was. I had it on the wing of the table saw and that just wasn't the most functional for me, primarily because I like to break down large sheet goods and I usually leave the router bit at the same height, which didn't work well together. And secondly, this needed to be a very quick and very simple project. I have orders that need to go out, so I couldn't take up a lot of shop time working on this. For almost all of my shop furniture, we use the same process. We start with glue and then use brad nails to hold the pieces together and then finish up with screws after. I tend to use parallel clamps to hold the box square and then finish up. So like everybody else, I started with measuring and marking where all my pieces go, and one thing that led to a far better final product was using the pieces to mark where everything was going to go. So I try to make all my layout lines. I have blown through enough brad nails and missed enough screw holes to start doing this. So I use an offcut piece to mark and measure everything, and instead of butting up a piece to a line, what I'm doing is taking a scrap and butting the board up to that, and that's going to give me a far more consistent than just trying to line everything up. And you can see I'm using that same offcut piece to mark where the pieces are going to go on the backside for my nail and screw holes. So there's two things that lead to me having really square cabinets. One is having a dead flat surface to work off of, and the other is having my table saw blade constantly checked to make sure it's at 90. But even with that, if you're not using corner clamps to glue up, it gets off sometimes. So while one side's perfectly square, the other side is way out of line, and I like how I check top and bottom even though I know the top is way off. So we'll just unscrew, clamp up with 90 degrees, and rescrew. So this section is going to be the housing of the router, and I don't own a router lift yet, and for that reason we're not using any glue. We're just going to screw this piece together. When I buy a router lift later on, I wanted to be able to just swap this piece out for something that fits the router lift. And this is the same piece of scrap that I used earlier. This is really how you get consistent builds, is using scrap pieces instead of using just marked lines on your build. I try to do this as much as possible, and I will absolutely waste plywood to cut it to the exact height or the exact width that I need a piece. This is really how you get solid builds that are perfect. There's multiple different ways you can build drawers, but for shop furniture in particular, I like to cut a slot for the bottom piece to go into, and mainly this is just so I can replace that piece later on if I need to. I'm pretty rough on all of my tools and I tend to throw them into drawers. So having that piece glued in permanently, I would have to rebuild the entire drawer. Doing it this way is going to be much better. So once I'm done cutting all the grooves in the pieces, I'll raise my table saw blade and cut off the back piece only. And doing this way does create a little bit of pinching on the piece. So I'll tell you, you only have to be hit in the hip with an offcut one time before you learn to move out of the way. So I didn't do a great job of showing how I assemble my drawers on camera. I tend to only put screws on one side or just the back or bottom. Then I'll slide my bottom piece on, and this does a really good job of squaring up my piece, and then I will finish screwing it up all together, and that gives me a nice square drawer. All we're doing here is essentially gluing on cleats. I'm going to have wheels on the bottom of this cabinet, so we're just giving myself a little bit more material to screw into. I have absolutely knocked off enough wheels on shop furniture by only having 3/4 inch screws. Now, there's a lot of fancy ways you can attach drawer fronts so you don't see any of the hardware, but for shop furniture, don't overcomplicate it. Use the brad nailer, attach the piece, and then screw on after. It's simple, effective, it works, and you're never going to notice the brad nails. Now, it was right about this moment where I realized I have the wrong hinges for this project. I'm pretty sure that's sign language for I messed up. So there's a very simple solution for this, and it involves just a little bit of brute force. Craig is known for their pocket hole jigs, but this jig for cutting cabinet hinges is really good. I use it all the time. It's one of my favorite tools. Second favorite tool is probably this hole punch. I use this all the time. It gives me very accurate punches. I like it a lot. It's far better than using a pencil mark. And while they are a little expensive, these Bloom hinges are really amazing. I'm jumping on the bandwagon for sure. Having the ability to connect these separately and just clip the door hinge on and off as needed, especially when I'm transporting and delivering pieces to a client, it's a big game changer. It really does allow me to take my products up to another level. When laminating two pieces together, I leave my pieces oversized. This gives me a nice clean edge to run against the fence, and I'll cut just a little bit over length, turn the piece around, and flush cut the final length on the table saw. This gives me a much better flush piece than if I just try to cut exactly the size to start with and glue up together. They're almost never perfectly the same, so this is a way better way to do it. Realistically, the glue is plenty strong enough to hold these laminated pieces together, but just out of habit, I still add screws for pretty much no reason. What is important though is adding a chamfer to your MDF tabletops. I do it with all of them. I didn't used to, and I found myself chipping off and breaking the table. This makes a huge difference, and ever since I started doing it, I haven't had any issues with MDF. Thankfully, this is a piece of my shop furniture, or right about now, I'd be realizing I need to rebuild my top since I put screw holes in the wrong place. It's just a reminder that a huge portion of woodworking is learning how to fix your mistakes. This is my third time installing this router plate in different areas of my shop, so I always seem to do something a little off. I'm centering up the routing plate, and I'm going to use this little jig to kind of frame it in and then cut it away. What I should have done is cut out with my jigsaw first. My jigsaw is probably 20 years old, and I didn't even want to go buy a longer blade. So this led to me not being able to cut all the way through the table, and it was just a nightmare. But we overcame. We had to cut our piece out, and then eventually I flipped the table over and cut out a larger section just so I didn't have to remove so much material with my router. So one of the biggest disadvantages if you're in between buying a lift and a router plate is not having any adjustability with the plate. You have to come up with some creative ways to adjust it. So I'm using washers here, and I'm actually using painter's tape is a really good way to add some adjustment. I've done this with the bandsaw fence as well to make micro adjustments. It works out well, and it gives me a dead flat surface. keeping up with the theme of not having the right tools for this project, like the hinges, the jigsaw blade, and not having the correct router bit to cut the 3/4 inch grooves for my T-track, all we're going to do is cut the groove and then move our fence over, micro adjustments, and cut again. And then actually using non-power tools, looking like a real woodworker for a second. As far as the fence goes, I'm not rebuilding it. I have one from where it was previously located on the table saw. That's why it's so short. This one works. I don't have a need to rebuild it. I just had to adjust the screw holes. Just to finish up, we're going to sand, and then as a top coating, we're actually going to use a lacquer 50/50 blend. Normally I would use this with polyurethane, but I didn't have any more polyurethane, so I figured I would try it with lacquer. It was okay. Super sticky. Normally I spray lacquer. I've never rubbed on lacquer, and I will say don't do this. It didn't really work out well. After about 30 seconds, it got really sticky and really hard to rub on. But as far as the final product, it seems to be working out well. We're just going to finish up with some wax on top, and that'll give me a buttery smooth surface and allow pieces to glide over the top.